Okay, so welcome back everybody that's here. Again, thank you for being here today. One of the questions that I received on break from a few people that I think is valuable is, do we offer individual classes? If you're here today for the first time, if you're not a student, if you're just visiting, if you're a professional, we do offer individual classes. And Hannah is outside, so you'll be able to stop with her at the table right outside the door and talk to her. If you're watching online, we do have Gnomon online as well. We have got some anatomy courses online that you can check out, as well as several other classes. Again, it's #Gnomon. If you want to fire any of those questions over now, or you have any questions, we do filter those throughout the show and present those to the artists, so we'll ask those for you and try to make sure we're paying attention to you there as well. I love bringing Ian in. Ian always does a great job. I really was not a very good friend to Ian this week. I asked him to do feather anatomy. Anybody here, has anyone tried to do in concept or model actual wings? Raise your hand. A few of you. Not as easy as it looks, right? And that's one of the things we want to do with kind of doing an anatomy lab is kind of pick things that are a little bit more crucial, a little bit more specified, and kind of figure out how to go about it. But more importantly, Ian, for years, has been one of the first people that kind of started out doing from concept all the way through to the finished model for the director. I'm going to let him explain that process to you today and what value that has and any limitations it may have as well. But again, definitely, if you have a question, stand up. I will walk over to you with a mic, ask questions as the event goes through. And if you're online, it's #Gnomon. So a big round of applause for Ian, everyone.
Thank you. All right, sounds like the microphone is on. My name's Ian Joyner. I have been working in the industry since probably about 1999, I think, is about when I started. Really got going in about 2003 when I started at Blur Studios. And I started as a as a 3D modeler, character artist. And it was fantastic. It was a ton to learn. The amount of work that we'd have to do and the time frames there were just staggering. But I learned so much in the time doing that. But I always had this craving to actually do my own concepts. And I had kind of focused all my eggs were in the 3D basket. So we'll go over a couple of the things I worked on, but I slowly started to develop a way to do concepting in 3D along with guys like Scott Patton, who was a huge influence on me, a good friend of mine when I started at Legacy Effects. One of the forefathers of kind of this methodology we're going to talk about a little bit. As Travis said, the sculpting of wings, which we'll get into in the second half of this, is not exactly an easy thing. And it's kind of funny, as I started putting together my whole portfolio for this, I realized I really haven't done a lot of wings. I've done a cartoon set once, and I've done one kind of rough, sketchy thing once. And then for fur, I usually do a lot of painting on top of it. So to actually model out some wings that seem kind of believable in a concept was an interesting challenge, and I wanted to do it in the time that I would do a normal concept. So we'll get into that whole process. But first I'm going to go over some other work I've done, a little bit about who I am, a little bit about the process, a little bit about everything. So here we go. All right, so like I said, I started off, my first big job was at Blur Studios. I was living in Florida at the time. I was mowing lawns and learning 3D on my own. I had gotten onto the ZBrush very early beta of 2.0 or 2.5, whatever it was, and I loved it. And I was doing speed modeling contests. I was online. It's actually where Travis and I first started talking, was online and just doing cool sculptures and talking about how much we love this stuff, and then bonding over martial arts and other things. But it was an interesting process because I literally didn't know what was wrong and what was right, and I think that kind of has defined a lot of what I've done in my career. I always learned a process and the correct way to do it after I attempted stuff. The first time I did 3D, I did a character. I didn't do a checkerboard with the chrome ball. I didn't learn box modeling to make a simple controller or something like that. I said, you know what, I'm going to make a cartoon character, and I'm going to rig him, and I'm going to try to animate him. I had never done something like that before. Learned a ton by doing this, and one night I was online, and a friend of mine who worked at Blur saw some of my work on CG Talk at the time, and said, maybe in a year or so you should apply here. Your work's really getting good. I was like, I have some stuff I haven't shown anybody. I sent it over to him. He goes, I'm going to show my boss this. Within 2 weeks, I was living in California from Florida, uprooted my entire life, complete game changer for me, and working at one of the coolest studios in town. Completely overwhelmed. I had never used 3D Studio Max at the time. I was a Maya guy, so I had to learn everything from the ground up and make sure that everything was still presentable. So it was a pretty interesting time to learn. One of the great things is that I was pretty confident in ZBrush and Maya, so I was able to translate myself okay. So some of the characters I did at Blur, you can see up here, a lot of superheroes. I'm a huge comic nerd, so that was awesome. And a lot of creatures. I did lots of bipedal, some dragons. And if you look in the corner there, you'll see that little owl character. That was for a ride film for Niagara Falls. That was like the first bird I'd ever actually attempted. And I forget who it was there who described it to me. I think it was Chuck or Sean. But I was trying to figure out these hands, because it was a cartoon bird, and we were trying to figure out how to do, articulated hands a la the old Disney films. And it's pointed out that, well, really, you look at the hands, this is what a bird's wing is doing, or a bat's wing is doing, or anything. And it just kind of clicked for me in a lot of ways to think about comparative anatomy. So I'm going to talk about that a lot today, because I am not an anatomy expert by any means, not like what you just watched. That was awesome. I'm confident in a lot of areas, and I've really more about the shapes and things like that. And then I go back and I have to study the anatomy again and go, what did I mess up? So we'll move forward a little bit. So the next thing I want to talk about is when I do creature designs or character designs in general, suits, whatever it's going to be. We're going to focus on creatures today, but I've done a lot of hard surface stuff, a lot of costumes for real people, not just digital stuff, but actual suits you have to wear when I was working at Legacy. Legacy used to be Stan Winston Studios. They did everything from Terminator, Jurassic Park, the Iron Man, Avatar, all sorts of really awesome things. I had a huge epiphany when I worked there, though. So up until that point, I had done maybe one 3D print. And I had done some sculpture and stuff for fun, but never really had to think about it in terms of what is this going to look like in the real world. So while I was there, I started to discover weight, and I started to discover what details really matter. I started to discover believable anatomy, and really kind of finding a way to do all of this in insanely fast time frames. So when I first started doing this, my presentation is a little out of order, I just realized, but I would actually model out a base shape, take it into ZBrush, and just mess it all to hell, and we'll show an example of that in a second. But recently they introduced a thing called Dynamesh. How many people here are 3D people? Okay, that's pretty good. So for those of you who aren't, Dynamesh is a way of basically digital clay, I think is the best way to put it. And I always think of it not just in a 3D way when I'm working in ZBrush, but is in a 2D thing. Because everything I'm working on is a sketch, and it can be developed very quickly, it can be tossed aside, it can be augmented, duplicated, moved very, very fast. And I find it to be a great way of working out new ideas, especially for creature design. So we're going to talk a little bit about Dynamesh sketching right now. So I teach a class, and one of the first things I do is I give everybody this generic bust. And we try to have everybody come up with fun ideas on it. And almost every single time after the first week they come back, it looks like the exact same bust but with some details on it. So what I always try to hammer home is that it's your underlying form that is going to make the biggest difference. It's the big structure that you need to worry about, the skeletal shape that's sitting underneath that, and then you put all the weight, the flesh, the muscle, everything else on top of that. So it's always funny, though. Every single class I've taught, it's always the same thing. About 90% of the students come back with almost nothing done to it, which is a good example because then I get to show them, no, let's really start changing this underlying shape and really understanding it. Then we get into doing skeletal studies. So if you look on here, the top one there is a quick ZBrush sculpt. Take into Photoshop and do a bunch of little sketches on top of it. These were some wraithy characters. I think the theme was Harry Potter, so we were doing the Dementors. And there's the final one there. So a lot of what I do isn't just 3D. A lot of it is half 3D, half painting, comp together. Sometimes nowadays it's a lot of keyshot renders, a lot of painting on top of that. And it's the way I like to work now, which means that most of my sculptures aren't very finished unless they were going to go to a maquette form. So what I really focus on is the areas that need the most detail. If I'm going to show a client something, do they really care so much about the foot, or are they really going to look at the face, torso, and overall silhouette? Generally, it's always going to be the big silhouette, and they're going to zone in on those two areas and say, oh, that looks cool, or oh, I don't like that. So I almost always focus on those two areas first and then get a cool shape for the rest of it. I find that usually gets us started the best, as opposed to going in and killing myself on a sculpture, then making another sculpture and killing myself on it. It's almost always better to just do something that's 90% finished and then let the rest of it kind of fall away. So there's some other characters. This is talking a little bit about taking that same base mesh and just augmenting it, tweaking those shapes around, making totally different characters off of the same, same simple points, and then into Photoshop to just kind of develop the character. Obviously, this isn't creature exactly, but hopefully the point is shown. So Dynamesh, for those of you guys who use it and those of you guys who are maybe interested in it, it seems to be the biggest problem that we always have is that people don't understand when to leave Dynamesh. It's this really fun, cool, freeing experience, but it's also very limiting when it comes to posing your characters. It's very limiting when it comes to really putting in final design. Unless you've got just a beefy workstation, it can just go very slow. So what I love to use it as is a sketching and just rough form development area. And it's kind of tough to teach that to people because they generally look at this and think like, well, I can add all the detail I could possibly imagine into it. So yes, you can, but at the same time, what can you do with it afterward? And to me, that's the most important thing. A lot of the work I do goes right to directors, goes to ILM, goes to producers. They might just look at the model themselves. They might send it off to do animation studies. They might send it off to a company to do animatics based on it. So because of my experience at Blur, I knew how to do very quick retop, and nowadays in ZBrush, it's click of a button, you can get something workable, and then do very quick maps and do all of this, send it off, people can work it out, figure out if this thing is going to walk correctly, if it's, if it really reads correctly in all these scenes. So that's where I found the 3D concepting to come in really, really handy. Even if it's a very rough model, it can give a lot of information very quickly as opposed to just one cool drawing. But it's always good to have something cool to show the client because if it's just a gray shaded model, they're going to look at you and say, great, what's this? So that's where I really started coming into to doing comping, and we're probably going to talk a little bit about that today as we move forward. This was the Fenrir Greyback character for the Harry Potter themed one we did. So talking a little bit about time frames. We were working on the Snow White film a while back, and they had an idea. They wanted to do a sizzle reel to show this director could do this movie. He wanted to show that he could do this movie. And he wanted a certain amount of budget for it. So back in the day, it used to be you'd go in there with some cool artwork and a nice script, and that would be enough. Or maybe you'd go in with a maquette and a cool artwork, that was enough. Well, nowadays they have become more about sizzle reels, and I'm seeing it more and more for pitch stuff, where you go in and not only are you just cutting together other people's stuff to show, like, this is the vibe I'm going for, they're actually shooting little pieces. And for this one, we actually created a bunch of physical creatures. So the pitch on this one was there's these creepy tree guys. I had one day to do them. So I went outside, I took a bunch of photos of some trees, got them scanned in, and I did 2 very quick sculptures. The first one on the left here, left, was obviously the more ant-like tree character. I had a lot of fun working on it, very strange shapes and weird kind of vibe to them. We sent this off, he dug it, but he said, you know what, I want them to be more old man-like, and they had a very loose sketch that one of the guys in the art department had done. So then I came up with this guy over here, and they did, they liked it. They said, that's the vibe we're looking for, more of a fleshy with some roots and stuff. But we didn't know about the faces, so after the first day, they asked for some variations, and we did a couple paint-ups. You can see the two characters here. Didn't know how embryonic it was going to be or how, kind of golem-esque it was. But they kind of went for the one that you see in the, there we go, in the previous example. Now, after they finished this, they realized, okay, we don't have the budget to 3D print this, which at Legacy, we did a lot of 3D printing. Almost everything at some point was either milled out or printed. So they just took the artwork and fabricated it and made a very cool, very simple sculpture. Filmed it over a weekend with a bunch of other footage. Director showed the studio, movie gets made. Pretty interesting process. I've seen it happening more and more these days. What's that? Access violation. How exciting. Yes. Technical errors are always the most fun. Okay. Oh, that's weird. Let's see if we can jump past that one. Maybe it'll. Okay. So the next project that I got to work on that I really feel I kind of came into my own in terms of doing this whole concepting thing was Cowboys and Aliens. To this day, I have not seen the film. I'm sure it's wonderful. But I had so much fun working on it that I just didn't want to actually go back. So this project for me was my first time really feeling like part of the Hollywood machine in a good way. I was there from the very first pitch. I got to go in and meet with Jon Favreau, Steven Spielberg, not to name drop. Yes, to name drop. And really show them like the ideas that we had. They picked one of mine and one of Scott's. We fused them together, and I got to take this thing all the way to its final completion. It was an amazing experience just to be in the room with these guys talking about creature design. I felt very old school Hollywood. A lot of times what I'm doing these days, I get an email, I send off a bunch of work, I get another email, I get a check. Okay, moving on, next phase. Which is fine and kind of nice, and you don't have to wear pants, so that's always good. But, there's something about actually being in there, the energy you get. So I really enjoyed that process. While we were developing this creature, we started sending off the model to ILM to do motion studies on. And they were working on motion studies while we were still designing this creature. It was one of the first times I really got to see that, only because instead of just doing paintings, we were also doing 3D models. So from the very earliest stages, they were able to start going, yeah, these legs might be a little too long for this kind of walk, or it's going to have to hunch around and walk kind of funny. So we really had to think about these things. Another interesting aspect on this creature, even though this is super old work, the little splits and things you see in him, one of the original ideas was he was going to be able to split into, kind of look like a guy on horseback from Silhouette. So his legs would split off into fours, his arms would split off and kind of shape into this kind of Indian on horseback or something. But they were working on Falling Skies at the time, another Steven Spielberg project, and he said, I'm doing a splitting creature right now, we can't do that. So we scrapped that idea, but we kept the strange little opening holes because it's more proof that it wasn't a guy in a suit running around. So a little bit about 3D printing and a legacy. So this sculpt here was a combination of myself and Scott Patton, and this was a pretty interesting sculpt that we did. The heads were magnetized, and the body, this little chest cavity, if you look to the bottom right, you'll see another piece there. The idea was that these little arms would fold out, grab onto things, and kind of do the more delicate work, and then these big, bulky arms would be used for slashing and breaking things and going crazy. Because these were supposed to be intelligent creatures. When you look at this nudist creature running around with giant forearms and claw hands, you go, well, how would they operate a vehicle? So that was the solution on that. To show that in the maquette form, we actually magnetized a little piece that you could pop in and pop out, show it closed, show it open, and then the head. So we were almost finished with this project. Everything was approved, and this creature had 6 eyes, and its mouth opened up crazy, and it didn't have gums. And the day we were pretty much getting started on this, in fact, they had already started doing some milling, you'll see in a second, the trailer for the Titans came out, Clash of the Titans, one of these Titan movies. Remember the Titans? No, it wasn't that one. And the Kraken shows up, and it's got 6 red eyes, it's gray, it's got big teeth. We go, oh, we got a problem. So we sent it off to them and said, look, guys, we're just raising this red flag. We just saw this design. It's very similar to what we're doing. So what we need to do is come up with some new heads, and we need to come up with them fast. And we'd already started the maquette. So we made the heads separate. We magnetized it. We made about 7 or 8 heads with different facial expressions and all the things it could do. So there's one of the final shots of it all painted up by the talented Legacy folks. The next thing I want to bring up on this one was, it was one of the first times I got to do a final sculpture that actually was the final sculpture. What you see here is actually the first grow we did came off in 4 quadrants. But originally they were going to do what they call a clay press on it, where they take it, they mold it, and they pour it in clay, and then they go and detail it. This thing had so much detail already, even though we didn't expect it to, that we realized we could actually get away with doing this thing all digital. We had to ramp up the detail to a whole new level, but we were going to be able to. So you could see where they were working on the clay press there, and then they realized we had to change the head anyway. So that was kind of one of the final designs that was then changed. Now here's the actual final head. So the differences were little, but what you could see is that we split off a bunch of pieces. And we were still really discovering the process at this time. So what we were doing is some of these pieces didn't fit very well because we knew they were going to be able to go in and just kind of find ways to do it practically. Nowadays, we've got the technology and the wherewithal to actually go in and make all those parts just done, ready to go. And you can see in the back of his head, they still did a clay press to save money. Rather than print another 4 pieces back there, they said, you're never going to see it when it's tucked into his little turtle shell. Let's just do clay on that. So it was a really interesting process. Learned a lot about what really matters in terms of detail on this one. Here you can see me holding up my one of the heads. And this one, because it was so large, we didn't 3D print him, we just did the head. They actually milled out the body, and the sculptors there went in and detailed it and made it look really great. And you can see some other fun things there. So another project that I was involved in from the beginning on was called the Neighborhood Watch, or the Watch. And this one started off with a lot of very quick sculptures, or most of these were actually 90% painted, just rough forms. And then the final design that was in the movie. Bunch of key art. Really important part of doing all this is you just do a lot of key art showing how they look in different lighting situations, expressions, and then a whole lot of clinical work too, which means model shots from every angle you can imagine, tweaking every little thing. What you can see here is the digital sculpture up in the upper left, then being painted from a 3D print, and then the final shots below. I believe John Sharefka painted this one, did a great job. And you can see the guys are working on the milled out body right there. We got a lot of detail on this one too, even from the milling, but they still had to go in and redetail all this up. And most of them were angry because I was doing a lot of ZBrush tricks to make certain type of textures that they realized didn't really, how would you translate this into the real world in foam? But they did a great job, and it actually really translated well. And then there's Doug Jones in the suit performing. So pretty fun to actually see this stuff come to life, rather than just be a digital asset or just be a little toy on your desk. It's him running around literally snapping at you. It was pretty great. Another process. You might notice there's a theme here. Now, we're going to get into feathers in a bit, but most of these things don't have fur. Most of these things don't have anything but scales or rough kind of texture. That's a couple reasons. One thing is CG does that really well. So whenever this stuff had to be CG, scales and rough texture like that works great. Fur, expensive. Feathers, whole nother level. So honestly, it doesn't come up too often. When it does, it's usually like accent pieces here and there. So here's one of the final designs of the lizard that we did. And here are some full-scale busts. These were about 4 feet tall, I think, because he's gigantic. And I have a spelling mistake there. That's wonderful. Let's quickly move away. And here you can see them all painted up with their miniatures next to them. Now, the miniatures were interesting because this time, we weren't really going to do those. We just started doing them for ourselves, and they became so useful that we started, every time there was a new version, we'd just print out another version and let them start painting it up. So here's some of the selections. These sculpts are gigantic. They're huge, and they're all 3D printed. There you can see a comparison shot of the little one to the big one. And the detail is pretty much lossless, even though it's a completely different technology being used for each one. The trick was to pump the detail for the large one to the point that it looked horrible in ZBrush. It looked like the crunchiest thing you've ever seen, but when you print it out, it was very believable and very interesting. So one of the interesting things on this character was the scales. Now, for those of you who do ZBrush, the first thing you think for scales is, I'm going to grab some alphas, I'm going to put them on my character, and then I'll pump them up as I need to. Or maybe I'll make a texture map and use that. Well, Legacy is an old school shop. They did everything by hand for a long time, and the supervisor on this was a very, very talented sculptor and one of the owners there, Shane Mahan. And he said, I hate that CG look. I just hate it. I don't want to see that on this guy. I want to see hand sculpted scales. So I had to go through and actually hand sculpt all the scales on this guy. Now, I say that, but if you look on the chest, I didn't hand sculpt those. I made some alphas and put them on there because you didn't notice it. But all the head stuff and all the shoulder stuff and all of that I had to go through. And I have some examples, I think, that I can show later that are literally hundreds of sheets of scales. I was on scale detail for maybe a month or two, it felt like. It felt like a year. But it was a fun project. I'm a huge comic geek, so it was pretty great to be involved in the creation of anything from Spider-Man, really. And then there's these guys. These were my favorite things I did on Spider-Man. They don't even show up in the movie, but I just had so much fun working on them. So there's a point in the movie where he's got these little rats, and he's injecting the serum into them, and they turn into big rat monsters. And again, these were done very, very quickly. I did 2 of them a day, They got approved that day, and then they had to change it about 2 or 3 months later because they realized they weren't going to show the transformation, and it was too weird to have this monster sitting in the cage, so we had to do something that was a little more traditional rat. But talk a little bit about the process of that. So, a little water. If you look up top there, I've got the simple base mesh of a mouse. I don't even know if I sculpted that mouse or if we had like an asset lying around that I retopped, but what I was looking for was a really clean, sculptable armature, basically. Then I decided to go in and do 2 different form silhouettes. Now these are wireframes, but you kind of get the idea that they're 2 different shapes. Once I had those going, I could go in there with all the detail. So I had some simple anatomy that I put onto the rat before I began. Then as I augmented them and tweaked them all crazy, I was able to have some basic geometry and basic anatomy to play with. Most of it very sloppy and rough, but it kind of worked for what I was going for. And so I could do 2 different variations on them very quickly. Using morph targets, I could go back and forth between them and make in-betweens. So the technology really came in handy rather than having to sculpt 2 things out of Dynamesh or clay and then go, okay, now I got to make another one, give me another couple days. This was just, once I had a couple basics done, I could make tons of variations on them. There we go. And there's one of the final shots of that mutant mouse, little silhouette detail to show the difference between the 2. And here's the final comp. So these were sent off to the director the day I finished them. He approved this one, I believe. And then, we sent out the files, and then a few months later they went, we got to change the whole thing. Oh no. I usually do these presentations like this because it's supposed to be less accident prone. I have some of these images raw if we keep having the problem. Okay, so you saw that final guy. So then, this was some of the versions that we did after where they had to look a little bit more mouse-like. This was obviously more naked mole rat. And this was the one that pretty much showed up in the movie. I'll just move this out of the way so we can look at it. But, a lot of this was just painted on top of using some textures, using just simple brushes to get some hair effects. Very quick. And one thing about concept work, as opposed to when I used to do modeling work, is the idea always ended up being more important than the refinement. And it wasn't until we finished something that the refinement really came in to truly matter. So once I finished those guys, I think we have some examples here. Oh. Brutal. All right, let me see here. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, we'll go over these guys here then. So here we go. So here's some of the 3D sculpts. You can see we keyed them out to get the most detail. They're pretty big. They're about yay big. Fully detailed. The detail that shows up on these is pretty much what you can get into it in ZBrush. It's really amazing what you can achieve with that program and with these printers these days. And if you really zoom in, you actually can see all the little micro detail really shows up. And one of the things we learned is you crank that detail to just almost an insane level, and it reads really well. So here's one of the final designs of the lizard full body. One of the last things we sent off to them, kind of before Sony took over and made the character work in film. Yeah, these are out of order now, so. That's a little quick. And there's the final mouse before printing. So designing in 3D, one of the big things you need to think about is designing in the round. You need to think about the weight, the gesture, you need to think about everything you could possibly imagine all at once. So a lot of times early designs will do more along the lines of a rough sketch. So this was for Godzilla. This is some of the first stuff, the first time I've ever shown any of this work. It's all in the art of, well, this isn't. This was some stuff done for a pitch that actually was never seen by the director. We actually got the show before we had to show the pitch. Weta was doing a lot of work on the film already, so we had a couple of these very rough concepts done, and then they came in and said, no, we got this design. So I said, great. So what I got to do on this show was take the rough sculptures that they had and a lot of the problems that they had and work in the anatomy and work in the detail and work in proportion. So we'll open up the first image here. So there's the final sculpt, and I also did a lot of paint colors. These are the ones that were in the book, so they're the only ones I can show, but there was lots and lots and lots of these. So there's a front shot of him and a back shot. And there was the front shot of his head. So these are in the art of book, and you can see them. I think they're credited to the wrong artist, but that's just, life. But this was the one that the director saw and said, yes, if that could show up in my movie, then we got it. Godzilla looks cool. Now, the hardest thing for him was figuring out the head size. We went back and forth on this head size a million times because it was too small at first, too big at the next time. The legs were too big, the legs were this. So I always liked that he was really massive, and I thought the guys at Weta did a great job of defining that basic shape because it was just so Godzilla to me, but still looked imposing. So it was really, really a pleasure to work on this one. A lot of fun detail, and a lot of fun figuring out the actual anatomy on it was very interesting too. So the other creature I got to do, which didn't really fall into the realm of the real world anatomy because this was very stylized. And one of the biggest notes we had on this creature was making sure it was very angular from every single shot. And that's very difficult to do when a creature is walking or when a creature is deforming in any way. So it was a real challenge, and it was myself and a bunch of other artists were jumping back and forth, but I'm just showing the images I did. I got to do the primary sculpture on this and a lot of the color work, and then it was sent off to MPC, I think, who finished it off. Some early shots of the walking version, color variations, and then the male version, or female version. But the winged version was really interesting because it had to be believable that it would fly, yet it also had to be able to go into a city and not knock over everything as it moved. So there's a lot of Hollywood magic going on in this creature where it was like, yeah, the wingspan might not be big enough. Very much based on like stealth bombers and things like that. But really fun show to work on. All right, let's see if we can get our open office to go back. Because if not, we have issues. I did, yeah. It was, I wanted more Godzilla, I'll tell you. I want to see more of the big guy. And more Bryan Cranston. I always want to see more of him. Funny thing about him, I don't know if you guys know this, he did the voices for a lot of the Power Ranger villains back in the day. So all the monsters and stuff like that, and then he was in, I don't know, I thought that was kind of cool. Let's see if we'll keep having this error or not. Okay. So another one I worked on that I can't show a lot of work from, but you can see it in theaters right now, it was Jurassic World. I can show this image because it was used for marketing. This was the final Pteranodon design, underside. I actually always liked the top side a little bit better, but this was a lot of fun to work on, and I think it showed up pretty similar to my final design in the movie, which is always fun to see. It doesn't always happen that way. But it was pretty neat, so I got to actually study we worked on a lot of stuff for that movie, and I got to really go in and study the bones and the musculature. Recent discoveries, obviously, about feathers being on these creatures were ignored for most part. We did get to add it to a couple parts, but because although these are real creatures, they're also characters, and that movie is all about a certain type of dinosaur. If you switched it over by the fourth one, people go, that's not a Jurassic Park dinosaur. So as much as they're based on a real creature, they're also very uniquely characters, and I think that's why I always loved that movie as a kid. Well, this is fun. We'll keep trying. Sorry for the technical difficulties, guys. So I think the last set of images we're going to go through before we start doing some live stuff. I worked on a book called Essence. You can buy it now in Amazon and all sorts of stuff. I worked on it with a ton of other really talented, awesome artists who Do everything from digital to 2D to sculpture. There's some great sculptors who just do stuff just in clay. And it was a real pleasure to work on. It was a lot of hard work. My house actually burned down in the process of this book, and I ended up losing all the stuff I had done, and then I had about a month to wrap up the whole process. Luckily, my experiences from other jobs, it was still doable, but it was a bummer. I had a couple designs I was enjoying working on that I just scrapped because there's a couple of them that are going to show up in here. So a lot of times I end up doing these bloodthirsty creatures or ghoulish monsters. I get to do some cartoony, fun things as well. And one thing I really want to do is something that was a little bit more charming. At the time, we had just gotten a young puppy. I guess she wasn't that young at the time, but she was young enough. And while I was working in the rental house, this dog would just come over to me, and I would just see these little eyes looking at me all day long. And she wanted to play, and she wanted to get attention. So I thought, yeah, that'd be a fun creature to do instead of just a big, cool-looking creature. Do something that's a little bit more fun. So this was the sculpture I called the manta pup. If you guys have ever seen the underside of a manta ray, they're adorable. I think it's their noses and their mouth actually looks like a little face. So when you see them together, you go, oh, they're so cute. But I just wanted to make something that maybe could go onto land and be hanging out in my house with me. So the idea was, for all these creatures you're going to see, they all existed in the same ecosystem. So these guys have these little digging arms, and they would hang around the next creatures and kind of root through their leftovers and eat whatever they could find in the beaches from them. So here's a polypaint version of that character. I like blue, so anyway, he became blue. A lot of fun to work on this guy. Oh, what a shame. Let's see, I might have these images to just find. Okay, so the next thing, we talked about the modeling and all of that, but one of the big aspects that we have to think about is presentation. And you can just do one render in ZBrush. It looks pretty good most of the time, but it's missing a lot. And one of the problems I always have with CG renders, sorry, a little parched. One of the problems I always have with CG renders is they look like CG renders, right? Like especially keyshot now, if any of you guys are familiar with that, you're seeing people do a lot of keyshot work, and it looks like keyshot work. But the guys who are taking that and then painting on top of it or doing a lot of work on top, it becomes very unique and interesting. And that's kind of how I feel about ZBrush. And there's certain artists out there who can do amazing stuff with just a few passes in ZBrush. And I love working this way. One thing that's great about ZBrush is it's very detailed renders. So when you want to blur away things and soften stuff, you've got this great crisp render to work with. Even to this day, having something like Keyshot, which is this amazing program, I still find I like doing renders in ZBrush sometimes. It can't do things like transparencies and glows all that well, but I like to paint that stuff anyway, so it's okay. But I'm more and more finding ways to use Keyshot as I use ZBrush, and I'm starting to find ways I really like it. Don't have any examples of that just yet that are available. And here's the final comp of our little manta pup. So very fun thing. I think the ground was comped in from some gravel out by the house I was in, and painted up some little weeds and stuff like that. I didn't show any of the food source because I thought that'd be kind of gross, but I was thinking about that while developing these creatures. Is what are they doing? Why do they live this way? What are they up to? He actually had a little snap tongue too, but I didn't end up finishing that. The next thing we have, we'll show these squid guys. These are kind of fun. Okay. So the next thing we have are these little squid aliens. And I did some quick sketches of these. They're going to be kind of a vulture-y creature that lived, kind of small, flying around. They would be bloodsuckers and feed off of the bigger creatures. So I was looking at plants and different creatures to figure out what I wanted these to look like. And this one in the corner was actually the one that kind of took us the furthest. Some weird sketches in Photoshop, just using weird brushes to find new shapes. When you're developing characters, especially in 3D, it's really hard to make those happy accidents. Dynamesh can help you with it, but one thing about 2D is you can make a couple weird shapes and suddenly you've got something really unique. 3D, because of it being so regimented, a lot of times it feels like a little too structured. So I'm always trying to fight that. And on this one, I kept falling into the same path, so I went back to 2D a little bit for this. And most of the time I'm doing most of my sketching in 3D, but every so often I go back. And here's a little bit of the process of how I sculpted this guy. So I started off with his main form and started coming up with this kind of flapping, gliding wing thing. As it kind of developed, I ended up around here, Actually, I ended up around here, but it felt kind of squat. So it was after I'd finished, I even did some color work on this, that I went back and said, I need to elongate legs. I want to get more of that insectoid kind of feel into it. But the idea was merging in some fish, some mosquito, vulture, and some squid, with just a little bit of inappropriateness hidden within. And here's the final model shot. So not based on real anatomy, but hopefully feels structural, and it feels like it could maybe move around and you kind of believe it. And here's some color samples. As I was discovering stuff, I like to take them into Photoshop and do weird color passes before I commit to anything. And then back to the ZBrush comps. So we did a depth mask, an alpha, quick shadow mask, and then just a raw color render. And came up with the first shot of him, which is him just kind of sitting on the ground, flashing to his mates or something. And he's got these transparent wings, which I always saw as kind of inflating a little bit as they were moving, kind of like little bubbles. And then here's a little swarm of them going and playing. So I pictured they were about bat-sized, and here they are, flying through the air. Bioluminescent little creatures. So had a lot of fun on these guys, a lot of painting on top of the ZBrush renders. And that's that. And then we have one last main one to go over, which was the Stargazer guys. These came together pretty fast. I liked the idea of these weird little slug eyes just looking up to the sky, and they're looking for those little glider guys. So they're going to feed on them, then they're going to make their little mess, and then little manta pups are going to dig around in it. That was the idea here. So these guys were mostly just opportunity hunters. That's why they have the kind of craning neck, so they could just snap up whenever they flew by. And just really playing with silhouette. So a lot of times when I'm working, I'm thinking about the believable anatomy. It's got to be key. You got to make sure that what you do resonates with the viewer so they understand what they're looking at. If you do all these weird, strange ideas that a lot of people like to do, they just don't really seem believable and structured. So I generally try to go more with the things that we see on our planet and then break them as much as I can. And I find that that's the stuff that usually gets approved for movies and games. When I go really weird with stuff, people go, that's cool, let's put that away. So I've kind of fallen more into the category of trying to find things that are a little bit easier to digest. So there's the sculpting process on him. He came together very quickly. And then once I was happy with him, I retopped him and got the arms and kind of came up with his little Nosferatu position here. Early on, I was still trying to figure out what these things were going to look like, if they were going to be kind of funny, maybe a little bit more of an herbivore. And then I did this thing, and I said, that's the face I like. So, just taking that and then painting over it, just like we did before with those witches and things. Color palette on him. Some fun stuff. These were ZBrush renders, so I actually did get some transparency, but it's all faked. Playing up some of the squid and just kind of some of the more grotesque kind of coloring and creatures that I've seen that I thought would be fun to put in there. And then the final render for this guy I never really liked, which we'll show in a second. I never got to finish it to the level I wanted to, and I always want to go revisit this guy again. But here's some color process of dropping the renders in, doing some basic atmosphere, putting in the little gliders, coming up with my colors. Did a quick negative pass because I wanted to see if the values were reading. Sometimes I do that. It doesn't always help, but sometimes it does. And then here's the final render. So what I never liked about it was I picked a front shot and a side shot, and it just wasn't very dynamic. I barely posed them, but they worked for the purposes of the book. So that's those guys. Now the next thing we'll go over very quickly before we get into some demo were some of the earlier random sketches. This guy's not really a great creature, but one of the fun things about him was it was the first time I tried this new technique of doing a sculpt, not even worrying about anything on it, just making it look cool, painting it, taking it into a render, and delivering it. And I thought the final render actually came out kind of fun, a little more cartoony than the other stuff. I don't know if he's presenting himself for something. So, playing with transparencies in ZBrush and just coming up with something. These were done for like a page of just sheets of things, so they never were really intended to be that big, but hopefully they hold up okay. And then here's some of the characters that were lost from the book that I always still want to go back and revisit. So I only have low-res versions of these. But these things were going to be these giant rock crushers that lived up in the mountains, and they would just plow through boulders and crush them up and try to find nutrients in there. And then there's as far as I ever got with the final comp for him. It was really done very quickly. You can see those little people down there for scale. Completely boggled. Oh my God. And then this creature was going to have some fur on it. And again, very simple sculpt, really rough forms, didn't even care about it. Took it into Photoshop and just started discovering what it was going to be. And I was kind of like this one, this vulture-y kind of face. I think that takes us through to the end of our initial presentation. So if Travis is in here, I don't mind you guys, if you have any questions at this point before we get into the demo process. I think we should.
Raise your hand. Come on by. See, all the questions are in
kind of
one corner of the room. Stand up.
Hi. So you began as a 3D modeler, and then you became sort of a conceptual designer, right? For someone up and coming, would you recommend that approach of starting in 3D and then going to design, or starting in design and perhaps learning the 3D?
You know, it's a good question. So these days, the line is very blurred. When I first started doing concept in 3D, 2D, and what I do right now, it's probably about a 50-50 split almost. I do stuff even rougher than what you saw for that book in terms of the 3D. The line is blurring, though. Where it used to be, you had your 2D artists, and then you had your 3D artists, and sometimes you'd have a 3D conceptual artist, and I think one of the first jobs I ever did for concept was just doing 3D maquettes. So they'd have a rough concept, and then I would take that and develop it in 3D, never to be an asset, but just to be a really cool-looking sculpture, but without spending a whole fortune on making an actual sculpture. So that was kind of my first foray into doing concept. And I started going, God, there must be a better way, and I was so stuck in process. So I started at Stan Winston's, and it was still Stan Winston at the time, then became Legacy. And my friend Scott was there. He was doing stuff that blew me away. He was doing stuff in a day that looked like what I was doing when I would model it, render it out, and kill myself. And he was like, yeah, I did it in my day. I'm going to go home and hang out with my kids. How are you doing this so fast? Now, the guy is ungodly fast, I will say that. But what he was able to do is he understood what mattered and what didn't. So he would do his rough sculpture, and he was a great sculptor, so he could get something very believable with a very minimal effort. And then he would do a lot of photo stuff on top of it, or some painting, whatever it needed to be, and he'd have a great concept at the end of the day. He was doing stuff in 3D about as fast as you could do it in 2D. That's the key. If you can't be as fast as the 2D guys, you can't be a concept guy. Because they're not gonna, like, if they came to me right now and said, let's see some stuff like that Spider-Man stuff done in, a day, and we need 5 of them, I wouldn't be fast enough to do that. I could do some rough sculpts, I could do some rough paint-overs, I could do some rough drawings and show them that, and then do one of those a day or something. That would be fine. But a great illustrator could just jump in and do really quick drawings that are really believable, very simple, and say, here you go. And the director could look at those, and we could develop them from there. Now, where we jump ahead a little bit with the 3D stuff is that you're getting them past that. And honestly, the way things are going, you can't show people like straight 2D art like you used to do it. You can't show a pencil sketch anymore. It won't be looked at 90% of the time. There are directors out there like James Cameron who will love to look at something like that. But 90 to 95% of the directors working and producers, they don't want to see that. They want to see the best representation of what they're going to see in their film. So 3D comes into play big time for that. And if you can do a concept a day, you can have a nice finished piece and then back it up with a rough model. Usually that's a pretty good speed. So this is a very roundabout way of answering your question. I will answer it. Don't worry. So now, this is years ago when I first started there. That's how it was. It was like, you're doing 3D concept design? Yeah, right. No, thank you. We have concepts. Here you go. So you had to prove yourself. Now, it's almost all 3D. Almost everybody I see is doing some form of 3D in their concepting. Environment artists are using it for backgrounds. Especially robot designers who are out there, they do almost everything in the 3D, and it looks great, and it's like, okay, well, who's going to sit around painting this stuff all day when you can show them exactly what it's going to look like? Now, creature designers are more and more going into this realm. So if you're a great 2D guy, and you have a little bit of 3D skill, you're fine. If you're a great 3D guy, and you've got a good 2D skill, you're fine. But if you haven't really picked your side yet, you're going to be stuck in process land. And process land slows you down. And if you're slow, then you can't really do concepts because you could be a production artist, absolutely, but you need to be able to go one way or the other very quickly and very rapidly give ideation on whatever you're working on. So my suggestion to any upcoming artist would be, what do you like to do most? Do you like to sculpt? Do you like to paint in 3D? Do you like to only do 2D work? But definitely learn the other stuff too. Because I have a feeling in a few years, the idea of just being one or the other is going to be out the window, and you're going to be somebody who either focuses on one side or the other and does really cool work either way. So pick which one you like and really work on it, but don't neglect the other skills. When I did that book, those are a number of years old, but I hadn't actually drawn anything in like 13 years. And I used to be an illustrator. That's how I started off, as in graphic design. I did illustration for like bands and stuff. And that's what I always thought I would do. Then I fell in love with 3D, and I dove into it head first, did nothing but 3D, which is really good for me in terms of where I am now, but it killed my 2D ability. I went to go pick up a pencil, and I'm shaky, and it's all that. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I really went back and said, I'm going to learn to draw, to paint, to sculpt, because it's all connected. Everything you do is going to influence the next thing. So if you guys are great 2D artists, keep being great 2D artists, and then grab some clay and start to sculpt, and then grab some 3D stuff and start playing in those worlds. I don't know, again, I'm going to name drop, but guy Simon Lee, you guys know him? Big Blue Tree, awesome sculptor, look him up. He works in Chavant like most people work in ZBrush or pencil sketches. He's fast, gestural, great designs, really cool creatures, brilliant artist. He's a guy who, he actually took my sculpting class my ZBrush class a little bit ago. And within seconds, a couple days of him working in the program, he was doing really cool ZBrush sculptures. My old boss, Shane, who I mentioned, he was the guy who sculpted the Terminator out of clay. Does you realize how hard that would be? It would not be easy. Now, we're all spoiled in our 3D world. You polish some stuff up, you make some nice, clean lines, you're done. This guy, all these guys, had to do it out of clay, and they did it really well. So I was teaching him ZBrush for a couple of years, really. We'd go off and on. He's a great ZBrush artist, and I used to do tours there, and I'd bring my students by, and he'd be working on something, and I'd say, you see that guy right there? First off, he sculpted the Terminator. How cool is that? But second off, he's only been using this program for a few weeks, and look what he's doing. And it's not because I was teaching him like the tricks of ZBrush. It's because he understood form so damn well that as soon as the tools were under his fingers and he kind of understood it, he was able to make stuff that was great. So because he could sculpt in clay, he could then sculpt in ZBrush once he learned the tools. And it really does, and if you work in 2D a lot, those abilities all cross-pollinate. Does that kind of answer the question a little bit? Okay, cool. There's another question?
I really enjoyed seeing the pictures of the workshop of the 3D prints. How has being able to see your work being modeled and painted by physical model builders, how has that helped improve your digital work? Hugely,
and in fact I have an example right here of it. So again, I'm a huge Harry Potter fan. And by the way, sorry, this is... So I used to hate Harry Potter. I hated it with a passion. I started at Legacy in 2009, and again, my friend Scott was recommending I listen to these audiobooks. I was like, Harry Potter? No, it's like a rip-off of Books of Magic. I don't care about it. He goes, no, it's great. Listen to it. I listened to the whole series. Now I've listened to it like 4 times, read the books. I love the freaking thing. It's just awesome. It's such a fun little story and a great world building. And still to this day, I think some of the best creature design and best art department that I've ever seen. If you guys pick up the art books, they're phenomenal. So I wanted to do my own house elf after I finished the first read through of the books. So this is my house elf. He's a nudist, and he has a cigarette. I don't smoke. I don't know why he does. But anyway, so I did this guy. Now you can see he's very top-heavy. Big head, right? Weird little body, skinny little everything. Well, I want to do a 3D print of him. So in working there, the first thing you do if you get a 3D print is you go to set it up and it falls over. You know you failed in terms of weighting and in terms of posing. When it comes to posing, it's actually not that hard, really, when you start thinking about weight distribution. If you I don't think I'm tethered to anything, but if you stand up on something, your main weight can be over this, you're going to balance. If I go this way, I'm falling forward. Well, I knew this in my head, but I didn't really think about it too much in terms of sculpting. So I started there, and I'd done a number of things. One of the first things I ever did there that got 3D printed was the Iron Man 2, the chest, and we scaled it to fit the actor, and it looked great. You know, everyone was like, great, cool, print it. I was like, we're going to do a maquette? No, it looks great, let's just print it out. Well, unfortunately, they didn't realize the first Iron Man was built for a 6'4" guy, and this one was being built for a much smaller man, and it was scaled accordingly and fit to his body perfectly. Well, we got this thing back, and I thought, well, I'm going to get fired. It looked like little baby Iron Man. It was this tiny little piece, and I went, oh my, did I scale it wrong? What did I do wrong? You know, they're new to this whole 3D printing thing. One of the guys who was there kind of supervising with me was going, what did you do? That's not what it looked like. That can't be right. I'm like, oh no. Turns out we did some measurements. We went point to point, got the calipers out, point to point. It was correct. So it was right. It just was a real bummer to look at and go, that's what it looks like. So the first thing I realized is, just because it looks good on the computer screen doesn't mean it's going to look good in the real world. In fact, I learned that lesson before that, and Travis was related to this one. I did some work with Gentle Giant, and they owed me some money. And I said, you know what? I'm going to do a presentation, and I want to show that you can make a character concept, turn into a gamer-as asset, and turn it into a maquette, all from the same asset, like that. Like, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be multiple people. It can be one person doing this thing very quickly. So I made a Wolverine sculpture. I was very happy with this Wolverine sculpture at the time. Now I look back and I cringe. But I then sent it off to get 3D printed. And Travis saw it, and he tells me, I really like how you stylized those legs. They're really big and chunky and stuff. I went, that wasn't stylized. That was me not realizing that ZBrush's camera at the time was so bad, it was distorting everything below the center point. I had no idea. I got this thing back, and I went, what is going on with that? It looks totally fine from up here. The legs just get... Now, what I was telling myself is it's because he's so heavy, so his legs got really strong, and that's the... No, it was me making a mistake. So I learned that lesson early on. So then we do the Iron Man thing. Oh, okay, then I learned I need to start doing printouts of my big scale things, because they're very expensive, and see them on the wall and go, yes, that looks correct, or no, that looks wrong, before I commit thousands of dollars to getting something printed. So I learned that lesson, and it was a mighty fine lesson to learn. And luckily, no fault was had by anybody. We all approved it, so it just moved forward, and we got it all fixed up. The suit looked great, no problem. So then we started doing maquettes. And my favorite thing to do is maquettes. Suits are cool. Maquettes are the coolest thing in the world, because I love to have a little version of something I worked on sitting on my desk. Like, that is the coolest thing. Now, all the things I'd done before that were busts, and then I started doing maquettes at Legacy, and I was terrified, because you've got these guys who, for years, 20-something years, have been doing this in clay, and they're going to judge you every step of the way. If you're doing digital stuff, they're looking at you like, nah, that ain't going to work. That anatomy sucks, that detail sucks, the weighting sucks, okay, your gesture stinks. Like, oh man. So I had to up my game a lot while I was working there. And when we started getting these maquettes printed out, even more so, you're taking work away from the awesome sculptors there, and suddenly it's going to the digital guys. So you could see some bad blood already starting in that area. So it better be good when it's done. Now, we have an amazing team there, so they were able to really generate some work that, blew us away. But now we can jump forward to this guy. I said, I want to get this guy printed. So I cut him up, made the keys, did all this stuff. Now, this is him lying down. I don't have a shot of him altogether, but the thing that made me realize that it was finally getting through my thick skull was I could set him up with not even gluing the pieces together, and his weight distribution from his giant head to his main torso to his hips to the weight of the legs was so good that he would stand up on the desk. And I went, yes, like, that's so cool. And from that moment on, it was a huge, huge change for me in terms of everything I worked on. I really wanted to make sure that if it would work in the real world, I knew it would look good digital. But if it looks good digital, you don't know it's going to look good in the real world. For those of us who are digital sculptors, how many times have we done, been sculpting on something and not realized something was more convex or concave than you thought it was? And you go in and look at it and go, oh, whoa, it was just a trick. It's like when you look at the inside of a Halloween mask, how it almost looks positive for a second. And then you keep rotating it, your eyes go, whoa, what am I looking at? Well, that's something I learned really early too, was you got to really pay attention to how your detail reads. So beyond all that, then having things painted by those guys. Now, I've only done a few little painting things of my own projects, and when I look at these guys' work, it just blows me away. But the interesting thing was, though I can't paint in the real world like that, I learned by watching these artists sculpt and paint in the real world and getting my hands on it and translating it into the digital world. So we started doing more and more things that I would see them doing in a practical way. I went, oh, I could do that digitally like this, or I could do that digitally like this. And it went from being, okay, I'm going to paint my character, I need a day for this, to going, okay, model's done. Let's do a quick paint job on this for about 20 minutes, and looks pretty good. Let's get this thing into some renders and see how it looks. It just changed everything, because it was, and then if I wanted to, I could go and spend a lot of time on it. But being around them was hugely influential in terms of my growth as an artist, and then actually trying it out myself. Getting my hands on clay, getting my hands on airbrushes, getting my hands on oil paint, whatever, you name it, just totally changed everything I was doing in terms of the computer stuff. I think we see a question back there, or am I?
Someone had a question over here?
I think I saw a hand raised.
Okay. Faux hand, or anyone?
Am I wrong? Oh, I guess there's someone here. Maybe it was just somebody moving back there. I have a light in my eyes, so all I can see is like little shapes and things back there.
Really good answers so far. Thank you for those. You pretty much nailed everything that I had a question about immediately. But as far as like influence, being a comic book guy, do you have any, like, what's your top read, or what are you reading currently?
Oh, comic book guy stuff. Okay, well, first to the influence thing, I'm going to go back a little bit and talk a little bit about like the stuff that you hear every answer. Movies, growing up, obviously, and guys like Frank Frazetta just changed my whole worldview. It was like, that is so cool. Look at those guys. They're awesome. They look real. And I loved comic books, too, so I got really into all that. But then the Dark Horse comics, the Predators, all that stuff, they just took me on a whole different direction. But early on, it was always like Ghostbusters. And I could never really figure out, why do I like Ghostbusters so much? Like, it's not a, obviously it's one of the greatest movies of all time, so that's a good reason. But the creatures and the characters were characters first. The ghosts had personality. They weren't just like, ooh, spooky boogeyman. No. These were like you wanted to know the story behind them. You wanted to figure out what was going on with them. Star Wars, same thing. You look at the Wampa, you look at any of those creatures, and it's like, they're silly. They're big guys in fursuits running around. Chewbacca, same thing. But he was so lovable. You just looked at this character and he just came to life. R2-D2 was a trash can, and you just were like, why is he so damn charming? And as a kid, I didn't really realize it. But when I was 12 years old, my dad brought home a Smithsonian magazine with behind the scenes at ILM, and it showed the creature workshops, and it showed the big room with Lucas standing in it with all the Star Wars stuff. And I went, oh, that's what I'm going to do for my living. I'm going to work in movies, and I'm going to do that. That's awesome. So those were huge on me right there. In terms of the comic books, like, I've always been into superhero stuff. In fact, I think the reason I got a job at Blur is because myself and the owner there, before they flew me out, I had like an hour-long conversation with him about comic books we were reading. At the time, it was Authority, and which was, I think, still in the first volume at that point, Transmetropolitan, Preacher, and then we started talking about superheroes, Deadpool, which he's now directing the movie. How cool is that? But we went into all these different characters, and we were pretty much totally in sync on all these characters and geeking out over this stuff. And I remember his quote to me was, all right, well, I'm going to fly you out here. Unless you're a total psychopath, you got the job. So I guess I wasn't a total psychopath, but or he couldn't detect it. So good on me. But those were the ones that really like shaped me in a lot of ways. But nowadays, like, the superhero stuff is cool, but I just don't really read it anymore. It's like occasionally I do, and there's some great stuff out there, like the Daredevil Mark Waid stuff is really great, and the Hawkeye stuff is really great. But I love the world building stuff. Saga is awesome. Chew is really great. All these different things like that. Just those kind of comics are the ones I'm really into these days. Less and less now. I have a 1-year-old, so I get to read, very, very rarely. Black Science is a really cool one, too, if you haven't read that one. Awesome comic. Any other questions?
I think we'll probably go to your demo now.
Cool. All right, so we're going to get into the demo of this creature. So like I said, I tried to do this thing in the time frame that I would do a normal creature design, but I took it a lot further than I would take most of these things. So there's a lot of stuff on this that I'm still working out. Anatomy problems, you betcha. But the main thing I wanted to figure out was the design of him and kind of what I was looking for. So let's just talk, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how to approach something like feathers, which are a pain in the butt. Okay, so this is something I've been doing a lot of times now when I'm designing a new creature. Now, I have a lot of iterations before this, but we're just going to go over this one really simply. So when I'm designing a new creature, I don't necessarily make an anatomy study all the time, But what I have been doing a lot of times is doing these rough form block-ins, and I'm finding them to be very, very helpful in terms of fleshing out problems I have, especially on something like this, which is a four-armed, basically, creature. Originally, I was going to do like a microraptor, but then I wasn't sure if it would be weird to do a dinosaur with the whole Jurassic Park thing, so I said, I'll make it into some sort of weird kind of monkey vulture thing. So that's where this kind of started to come along with. So I'll just kind of do a quick demo on how I approach a new character. And this isn't going to be super sexy looking, but it's something I've been finding really useful, and I've been teaching my students this lately, and I'm seeing them evolve much quicker. So I just want to bring this up before we get into the whole feather thing. So for those of you guys who aren't really big ZBrush people, bear with me. I'm not going to go into too much technical stuff because we don't have a lot of time. But what I do want to talk about is kind of some of the bigger issues that we're going to have when we're doing like massing in forms. So if we look at any animals that we're looking at as a reference point, we can usually block down. In fact, let's do that right now. Oops, wrong thing. We can usually block down some like core shapes pretty quickly. So here's some of the animals I was looking at while I was designing this creature. Cassowaries, secretary birds, hawks, always cool, eagles. These were bearded vultures. They're awesome. They look insane, and that's kind of, these are the core piece of inspiration for this guy. Look at those crazy things. So as we start looking at the feathers of this, these are more hair-like feathers, so I kind of wanted to avoid that. We'll get into a little bit of it. This is the tip of an emu claw, of a cassowary claw. Not their feet, but their wings. And I had no idea they had barbs on their claws, so I thought that was a very interesting thing to discover. Then trying to understand the anatomy. Some of the best things you can do when you're trying to understand anatomy is look up bald or mangy animals. It sounds crazy, but there's a sun bear out there that's completely gone bald, and there's all these amazing photos of it. And if you really want to understand, because feathers change the hell out of the look of these things, right? But this is the basic anatomy happening under the bird. I mean, obviously two different birds, but the idea is there. Also, look at the way their mouths open. That's just bizarre. So trying to look at these creatures in terms of what elements I liked from them. Ridiculous looking and, frankly, a little vulgar. But the feathers come in a million different ways. We were trying to figure out what I was going to do for this. Are they going to be slick back? Are they going to have maybe more of a vulture type look? Are they going to be just wild and crazy like this? And I decided that yes, they're going to have all of those things because that'd be kind of fun. And then I was thinking about other animals that have comparative anatomy to what I was kind of doing. So I thought about kangaroos. Oh, this one won't play? This is an animated GIF, and it's very funny. Or GIF, if you want to be that by. Yeah. And no, that's not a Muppet. That's a shoehorn. So then looking at dinosaurs, as they were going to be a big influence on me. This is what I was originally going to do. And then a flayed ostrich. Delicious with a little butter. And then just some cool color stuff I thought was kind of interesting. Okay. Again, looking for these plucked birds can be really useful. These are chickens, so they're not going to fly, but they give me some ideas. You'll get better than that photo. This is from a book called, what is it? Tim Flatch. I forget the name of the book. It's not Animal. It's called something else.
If you just remember
Tim Flatch, buy all of his books. They're fantastic. But there's a whole series of these things. Okay, so anyway, looking at all the different types of feathers. Now look at how they are when they're first forming to when they start growing up more to when they're first born. So here's the question. When you're approaching something with feathers, how do you approach it? So I looked at it like approaching it just like I'd approach anything. First, I had to figure out the rough anatomy. It doesn't matter if it's going to be a super tight model underneath, because these feathers are going to cover up a lot of stuff. But I did think it was important to have the base structure on there. Also, kind of fun. So when I'm blocking out these creatures, could be any type of creature these days, this is kind of how I approach it. I look for the torso, the hip, and the head. It's the most important part usually. Doesn't have to be a perfect idea of where we're going to go with this, but just good enough to give me some shape. Now, some of you who are ZBrush people might be wondering why not just use Z-spheres? Because they're so uniform, they always kind of feel like the same shape. With this, I can actually do very rough block-ins of crests or of weird shapes from the sides. I don't know, I just find it a little bit more useful.
And Ian, when you're dragging out with the move tool, are you using a hotcut key for duplicating? Or
Yes, I am. Sorry, sometimes I jump forward on all this. Yeah, so this is a cool little ZBrush trick I guess a lot of people don't know, and I always forget that. If we mask off an area of any ZBrush sculpture by control dragging or topo masking, we can duplicate that piece, so long as it has no subdivision levels, by holding control and dragging in the center circle. So I could be more precise about this and actually make really perfect little pieces, but that's not the point of what I'm doing. The point of what I'm doing is to really rough out the basics here. And sometimes I'll do this thing when I'm making like a vertebrae to kind of figure out like how it's going to go, and this can be fun. Or you can make it just a tube. It doesn't really matter. The most important thing is you don't just merge all these pieces together. So the next thing we'll want to do is insert some sort of wing shape. And what I did for this was I wanted to really understand wings and how they work. And remember when we talked about comparative anatomy, I found a couple images online that I found very useful. This stuff, when I was learning anatomy and as I continue to learn anatomy, I find absolutely fascinating. The fact that a whale, a frog, a horse, a lion, a human, a bat, and a bird all have very similar anatomical structures. You don't look at this and say like, oh, it's that could be just like a big fat guy's hand. I don't know, but no, it's a whale, and now the skin has evolved in a way to allow it to swim. The horse is actually fused into a running position. It doesn't actually have to hunt or anything, so it doesn't go supinated or pronated. It can just stick to its one direction, so it can run very, very fast. Lions are able to grasp, so they are able to turn their claws around. Now, when it came to birds, remember what I talked about early on with the fingers, it's a little bit different. Bats are pretty literal. Bats are definitely, they're doing this, haha. But birds are not. Birds usually have something along these lines. Some of them are a little bit different. We'll look at the cassowary, for example. But very similar. So for someone like me who's not what I would call an anatomy expert, it made sense. I could look at this and go, cool, I get the basic shapes that are happening here and what they're doing. The next thing I had to understand was, here's another example of that, the next thing I needed to understand was like certain things in terms of, and I learned some of this on Jurassic actually, but the chord shape on pteranodons and birds is actually very similar in bats in terms of how they would fly. And there's a lot of debate about where they actually connected. So early drawings of those, you saw them almost like bird wings where they kind of came out from here and did this. Now birds have the feathers that kind of fill in the gap, but they do have some of these little tendons that are filling in the gap so they actually can catch all the air that they need to. We have all of our fun little images of bone names and figuring out where do the primary feathers and the secondary feathers connect. So feathers are tricky. There's a lot of different ways that feathers kind of work. There's also a lot of different ways that birds fly. There are glider birds, there are long-distance birds, and if you look at the way their feathers are designed, they're all designed very specifically for their needs. So something like a cassowary has nothing because it doesn't fly. And I shouldn't say nothing because it actually has something. Let's go back to that image. I think it's kind of interesting. Where do I have? Is this it here? No. Well, I thought it was in this folder. Maybe it's another folder. Here it is. So the cassowary is pretty interesting where we can actually see that they're digits. One of them is hidden, and then it's got these two with the claws on it. So I really liked this element as I was doing my research. And even though mine's going to be a flying bird, I liked the idea of it having these little talons exposed, just to give it a little bit of a design beat. So unlike when we're doing studies of animals, where we want to be very strict and make sure that what we're learning from these things, when we're designing creatures, we get to borrow and mix and match. So I'm not going to go into the whole blocking thing. I think you guys kind of get the idea. But the trick with doing these wings and doing all this spine stuff was just what I was showing you by duplicating those pieces. Now, I don't fuse these parts so that I am able to very roughly change proportion in a way that lets me go, yeah, that's kind of cool, or, maybe these look better being a creature on all fours. Maybe that's going to be a more interesting design. And this is much faster than trying to do this with just a Dynamesh sculpture. Z-spheres are actually even faster for doing this kind of work, but the next thing I can start doing is looking at this thing and figuring out its silhouette. We'll go back a few steps. So I might start off very, very kind of boring, but as I keep playing with it, I can start playing with the flow of the tail, coming up with the mass proportions of how this is all going to work together. And then decide, okay, cool, this is roughly it. Now at this point, I'll do something very, very silly and very simple. I'll just fuse all these points by inflating them. And if you take nothing else away from this demo, take away the idea that you don't need to be precious about your work. It happens a lot of, oopsie, I already messed something up here. In fact, I'm going to be so unprecious about this work, I'm just going to tuck it into his body. So you don't need to be precious about your work. And what I mean by that is if things go wrong, let them go wrong and fix it later. Don't spend all day trying to fix something because the first time it didn't work. Oftentimes, if things don't work, smooth them out and redo it. Okay. So now that we have this guy, we're going to start inflating some parts out. And the inflating is just so that when I turn this into a Dynamesh, it's going to turn into one nice piece. I lost his little Alula finger here. Now when you're working in Dynamesh, sometimes you need to keep things a little bit more spread out than you initially want to, and in terms of gesture. That's because things will start to fuse together. So I'll oftentimes make things a little bit ugly. I try to keep things relatively pleasant to look at, because if a client comes in or demands that they see something early on, if you're really, really sloppy with your stuff, that can get really nasty really fast. So I'll spread some things out so we don't have too much fusion happening. And then from this point, I can turn this into a Dynamesh. Dynamesh is, for those of you who aren't ZBrush people, it's a way of turning this into a big lump of clay. So I'm going to basically melt it all together at this point. And I always start really low res. I dragged and dropped a little more. It shouldn't be 344. It should have been like 32. We'll give it a second. You can't escape out of this, unfortunately. So that was way too high res. We don't want that. We want this to be so low res that it almost looks like a lump of poo. There we go. Perfect. That's what we want. So at this point, I'll start to inflate some parts that got too thin, and I'll start to keep working on some of this, and then we'll smooth out some parts. You can see now it's all fused together, right? So this is, for those of you who are sculptors, you made your armature out of your wire and tinfoil, and now we are fusing our clay onto it. And like the fingers disappeared, I don't care about any of that. None of that really matters to me right now. The base structure is all I really have to worry about. Okay, keep applying our Dynamesh, and we can make this thing into as tight as we want it to go. So as I keep going, I'm working out the anatomy and sculpting out all the detail, and we get to a stage. We'll call it like this stage. Now, after I finish, it took about 20 minutes. After we finish the Dynamesh sculpt, we do a thing called Z-remeshing, which I'm not going to demo here, and we project our Dynamesh sculpt back onto it. So it's going to look really rough, and then we step it up. Whoop. And we'll have all of our details back on there. But what's nice about this now is we have something that's very easy, should be very easy to pose. Wow. And I get more laughs out of these things by doing simple stuff like, oh, look, he's walking down the stairs. Huh? Elevator up. Yeah. It's a good time filler. Okay, so the next thing we have to figure out once we do this is we've got our anatomy figured out, but that's not even half the battle, to be honest. It's the feathers are key. I mean, look at this guy without feathers. He looks kind of funny. You put the feathers on, and suddenly you're like, that guy's going to mess some stuff up. So how do we do this? Like, how do we start figuring out feathers? Are we going to go in and model everyone individually and then just start hoping that we kind of figured it out? Well, no. I think that would be horrible. So what I do instead, let me turn off our feathers here. I even named the subtools. I don't normally do that. We'll start looking at this. So the first thing I did is, early on, I actually had this going even on that rough sculpture, is I will block in a massive shape that is my wingspan. That means that from this far away, I can look at him and get my silhouette read. This right here is everything. If you guys can get this to look good on your creature, you're pretty much done. The rest of it is just icing on the cake. And I tell people this all the time, and they don't believe me, but it's absolutely true. If this is readable to a client, it's going to be pleasing to them. If it's hard to understand what's happening, it's not going to be pleasing to them. So I do that little black and white thing and zoom way out all the time when I'm working on creatures. It's all about silhouette. So the next thing I had to do is say, okay, that's the big feathers. Now I need to dissect and learn a little bit about how wings really work. And did I not? Oh, here we go. So again, thanks Google. I started to learn a little bit about the way feathers actually overlap and the way that they actually work in terms of structure to wing, to where they connect, to all of that. Now, these are called the bastard primaries. They're also called the alula. I just want to say that because I get to say bastard. And what I learned on this project was that those are used in terms of getting just a little bit of flight for going up and down. They're able to twitch those just slightly, and they get a little bit of direction changes. It's amazing to think of all the things that are going on as a bird is flying. And as you work on these characters, I know more about dinosaurs and sea creatures and all this stuff than pretty much anyone else in my family. And we go to the zoo with my daughter or something, and I start mentioning things like this, and they look at me like, why do you know that? And that's why. You start learning this stuff. And you got to know something of this. You don't have to be an expert all the time, but if you go into a meeting with certain people and you just throw out like, I just thought they looked cool, well, guess what? You're out. You're done. They don't want to hear that. You want to have a reason for everything that you've done on your creature. An example of that was on that neighborhood watch creature. He had a secondary spine that was exposed in his back. That came about because one of the producers saw Dune the night before and said, that looks awesome, I like the big spinal column. Well, yeah, but he's a creature, why would he have that? Well, I had to come up with a rationale for it. So my rationale was that he's a shape-changing creature, and the spine is independent and can actually connect to a secondary spine so that he can telescope himself and be able to fit into whatever type of shape or need he was going to have. That was my completely bullshit answer for why he had a spine sticking out of the back of his head. But I did have to say it in a meeting, and the director said, oh, yeah, okay. So it worked. I have a feeling on that project I probably could have just said, it looks cool, and they would have said, okay. But always works better to have a little bit of an answer. Okay. So once I figured out this, I had to start coming up with the overall feathers. So let's talk about how I did that before I go into this. So the first thing I did, looking at this reference, and looking at this big group shape of the primary feathers. I didn't even care about counting them because what I found is that different birds have different numbers. I didn't care about the shape of them yet because, again, I found that different birds have different types of shapes. Owls have a very distinct shape to their wings and their feathers because they need to be stealthy. You won't hear an owl until it's right on top of you because of their feather design. It's amazing. Vultures and other ones that have to glide around for a very long time looking for their prey, very different feather design, very long because they have to get, I guess, more air up there. So I blocked in my main shape. This was very easy to do just by using a box and shaping it around to where it looked good. I could demo that, but I don't think it's going to be all that interesting. So the next thing I wanted to do was come up with these primary block-ins. And this was really easy to do with some of the new tools in ZBrush. using the topology tool, taking a look at these feather designs here, I said, okay, well, that's roughly the shape. It's kind of this little nacho shape. So let's go in there and make a little nacho shape. So the primary feathers are going to do something along this line, something along this line, and something like that. Okay. Again, I don't need this, pardon me, I don't need this to be like super perfect. I do need it to be roughly a shape I can play with. So beyond it being really like clean, what I really care about is that it's going to be very simple. So once I have my shape done, I could extract that shape off. And then we'll just split it off. Okay? So, because I'd already shaped the big simple one to the shape that I thought the wing should go, I now had a secondary shape being made that I could manipulate very, very easily. Okay, so that was my primary feathers. Great. We'll look at a little bit nicer version here where I tweak them a little bit more. Didn't really care about where they were connecting because I knew I was going to make individual feather shapes. So the next one was the secondary feather shapes. So again, going back to our overall block-in, I think you guys will get the idea of what I did there. The secondary shapes. These are the next most important feathers when it comes to flying. So when they fold up their wings, I found that the primaries will actually fold over the secondaries, and they can all tuck back. Now, folding wings is one of the hardest things to do, really, period. I haven't had to fold these wings in yet. Now, without rigging this thing properly and figuring out how this would all work, I would have to do it individually. So what I'd probably end up doing, if this is going to be a sculpture, I might make two different sets of wings for my design. I might make a folded shape and I might make an open shape, and then just when I pose them, I'd have one or the other to place them to where I want it. Because otherwise I'm going to have like 100 different wings I have to place every time. Now, that's a good question. I might find that, but there might be a simple thing like bigger opening, or maybe if it's coming down like this, that I'd probably just use the opening shape. And then I'd have the closed shape for when it's standing on someone's shoulder or standing next to somebody, and we'd go from there. So when you're sculpting these shapes out, you actually have to think a little bit about that. Hopefully the shapes that I've done here would be usable in the widest variety. That's kind of what we always want to achieve. So the next thing I had to do was keep going through here. Oops. Let's just turn all the feathers on. And learn a little bit about all the different types of feathers I was going to want to have on this character. Not that character. This character. Okay, so then I had my basic block in. Why this was important is because, once again, my silhouette reads, and now I'm getting secondary value read. So this didn't take very long. This was, once I got the basic idea down, you saw how quick it was to extract that shape off. I was able to really quickly do it. So now we have our basic shape. We're feeling pretty good about this whole thing. And I'm not worried about the feathers on the body. What I'm worried about is these big wing feathers, because they're just tough to do. How will we achieve them? There's a number of different ways we could do it. We could model a beautiful feather individually, which I actually kind of did on one of them, or we could get an alpha and extract it, which I also kind of did. What I discovered was that on a character like this, this, what it was really going to come down to was getting our main flow and feel, and then coming about it a couple different approaches. Because I didn't have a ton of time to do a million feathers. So I made one feather, and if you look here, do I have a secondary? No, I don't. Okay. Now you can see I have some overlap happening. I thought I fixed that, but I might have grabbed the wrong file when I came in. So you'll have to bear with me for a moment as we connect the stems into their proper places. So this is a little bit tedious. I had to make individual feathers this way. Now, very tedious, really. So we have a couple tricks in ZBrush. If I just had to make one every time, that little duplicate trick I had before wouldn't work because these actually have some detail on them. Now, right now, they're all the same shape, all the same detail. That wouldn't last. As I keep going on this thing, it's going to get covered up. So you won't actually see that, or I'd go tweak them individually. But what I really needed to figure out was, how am I going to place all these feathers if I only have one shape? So let's do that right now.
I'm so glad I asked you to do wings, because as usual, you always do a pretty kick-ass job.
It was a pain in the
And
butt.
you
I
did
will
most
tell
of
you.
this in about, what, a day, I think?
I did it all yesterday afternoon, right before I picked up my daughter.
You just made half the students watching suicidal.
I mean, yes. Actually, wait, if any potential clients, this was a couple days of work. Don't ask me to do anything with wings. Okay, so I had to figure out a quick way of coming up. Now, this was kind of the fun part about doing this character this way, is that I had to come up with a way of doing a lot of feathers relatively quickly and making them look like I put a lot of work into it. That's about most of my job. I have to do a lot of work very quickly and make it look like it's really finished. When you really dissect it, you go, ooh, there's a lot to be solved on this. So one of the first things I did, I just split this guy off here so we can play with him, and I have him on the highest resolution, is make an insert brush. So I'm going to duplicate him one more time because I don't want two of these on here. Oh, I have symmetry on. Okay. So we're going to make our first insert brush, and this is kind of how I approached doing these wings. So first off, before I even get into that, we're going to do a little bit of a dissection on this. How did I make that wing? Or that feather, excuse me. I took that big base shape I had, and I extracted off a very simplified version of it, just like we did before. I then used a tool called Z-Modeler to go in and make a little stem piece to go along the wing, and then polygrouped it so that I had a nice, easy time making things thin and having things bulge out, so it really wasn't that difficult to make this initial feather. And then, very quickly, and this one I smoothed out a little bit, I just put in a couple little detailed pieces on this. It could get a lot more detailed, and it would get a lot more detailed as we move forward. We'll see how much time we have to go in and detail this. So, once I had that finished, let's find our feather again, I needed to make an insert brush. This thing is 120,000 polygons, so it's actually not that bad for a brush. Now, insert brushes are interesting because they actually, when they're made, they go from the direction of the camera, not the direction that you made them at. So this first primary feather, I needed to make a nice one. So this is going to go tip out to the point of the stem. So I lined it up. I went into here and I said, create insert mesh. New. Okay, we've now made an insert brush. Now watch what happens when I draw this on here. Now what's cool about this is, A, different sizes, that's great, but if I was a little bit less lazy, I would have made multiple different shapes of each feather, and then I would have been able to go in here, and in fact, let's do it right now, just for the heck of it. Maybe this is a little bit wider and a little bit more blunted. Maybe a little bit straighter, something along these lines. Okay. Keep making it wider here. And the next thing we're going to do is change some details up because otherwise it'll look really obvious that I just kept making the same feather. Now the way I tricked the viewer initially to make it look like it wasn't the same feather was by shaping them. But this is the other most important part, is actually changing your detail. So this doesn't just come into feathers, this comes into anything. If you're going to make horns for your character, if they're going to have belt buckles, if they're going to have a couple different guns, generally those would be pretty similar, but maybe you want to tweak up some detailing on those. Buttons, you could maybe have some have different scratches on them, all sorts of good stuff. Okay, so now we've made our second feather. It's not all that different than the first, but let's play a little bit with it. Now, I could be looking at reference to really make some good feather shapes right now, but this is more about proof of concept than that. I do recommend, if you guys are doing this, though, that you do exactly that. So now I'm going to do create insert mesh again, but whoops, let's just do this. I messed up that one. I want to go back to my first brush, make sure it's lined up in a nice way. Create insert mesh and say append. So now, if I hit the M key, I have two different feathers. Wonderful, right? So let's go to our funny little sketch bird over here and just talk a little bit about how you can apply those. You can't do this onto objects that have multiple subdivision levels. So what I'd have to do is either delete the subdivision levels, and that's really what I did for this guy. I duplicated him, stepped him down to maybe like 3, and then we started putting in these feathers. So my angle was a little bit off when I created that insert brush, but that's okay. Really not too hard to tweak these things. And we could place them this way. And this is how I did more of the secondary feathers than the primaries, because the primaries were pretty easy to duplicate since there was a very small number of them. But once we got these things kind of placed in, they were very easy to put into place. And what's nice is you notice that they're drawing right from the tip into the point. So worst case, all I have to do is a really simple rotate to get them into place. So we'll delete that. So that gives one idea of how we could start making these types of feathers. So the next thing was coming up with the secondaries, which on these ones I believe I did an extract from an alpha. Yes. So what does that mean, an extract from an alpha? So there's a couple different ways we could approach this. The secondaries were a little bit more blunted, and there's a lot more of them, and they connect in to the forearm and bicep area of our bird shape, bird wing. Another thing about the anatomy on these that I thought was interesting is that birds have very small biceps, but gigantic pectorals, because that flapping muscle is all in that energy right there. So to make the next type of feathers, we went in here, find our secondary shape. A couple different ways we can do this. So I looked up some images on the Google, found some cool alphas, and then I tweaked them. So let's say this feather right here is what we're going to use. A couple things we could start with. And this is actually, I think, how I ended up doing this. Kind of weird. I made a alpha off of this. I made a 3D off of my alpha. So first made sure that was selected and said make 3D. It makes a new subtool, and it's got this kind of gross-looking feather here. But it gave me a nice, simple shape to work with. And apparently masked some stuff off, too. Now, what's nice about this is I can divide this thing up a few times, and I'm going to now use a mask, and I could actually, excuse me, not just a mask, I could shape it off of this. Wrong side. So here's one way about going about this. But this is a little bit tedious. So what I ended up doing instead, but this is a fine way to make quick feathers too. Just wanted to show that. But this is much easier. So first I was trying to make it all precise and make a nice shape, and I was going to retop it and do all this. And I said, you know what? This is fine. So, make polymesh 3D, and divide this thing up a few times, and change the focal shift. Now you could make a number of different feathers this way. I'm going to repeat stroke to get this a little bit tighter. And that looks pretty good. So then we're going to make an extract off of this. And there's a couple different ways we could have tweaked this to make our feather a little more precise at the bottom here. But it's almost just as easy to do what I'm doing right now. Whoops. It's like, why is it drawing so strange? So what's nice about this is it's going to be a little more organic than what I did for the primary feathers. And what I'm looking for here is that this is mostly all fused together. So from this point, I can extract a part off. I want the smoothing to be 0, and I can extract a simple shape like that. Or, let's just do it. Okay. Or what would be even better would be to add a little detail before we extract it. It's probably a smarter way I could have achieved this, but this will work fine. Turn the intensity down. There we go. And when I'm smarter, I actually do this in order, but there we go. Again, I am not so much concerned about making this perfect feather piece. I just want something that's going to have a little bit of detail to it and kind of read nicely. That's good enough. Okay, so when I extract this one now, accept it, you'll see that we have a really cool looking little feather here that actually should have some thickness to it. Made it a little too thin. Let's make it a little thicker. I'll usually overdo the thickness on stuff like this, and then I'll fix it after that, which I'll show you right now. Okay. So first off, we have a negative on this side and a positive on this side. We don't want that. The next thing is we have some rather strange shapes happening here. So the first thing I need to do is clean this up just slightly. And then I need to mirror it. Because I like what's on this side and I don't like what's on the other side. So I'm going to make it really thick for that reason. Go to Modify Topology, Mirror and Weld. And it's on the wrong angle there, so let's just see if I can make it work this way. There we go. I'm bypassing some of the technical stuff, so if someone's confused about what I'm doing, please feel free to ask, and I will be happy to describe. But I want to get as much as we can get done as quickly as possible. Okay. So now we've got this feather done. And now we want to crush it down a little bit. And maybe go in and detail it up a bit. So maybe I use the elastic brush and really enhance the Ooh, I'm rusty without being on a Cintiq. So we're again focusing on this from a design standpoint, not from making perfect feathers. What this is going to become is something that we can paint on, or something that we can get a cool render of, and it's going to give us a nice little breakup in our silhouette. So do I care about it being the most precise feather you've ever seen? Not at all. In fact, that would be one of those things that we call a time suck. So it's great if you guys want to go in there and make perfect feathers, and you would probably need to go back and do that if you're doing a maquette, or if you're going to do like a full-sized feather grow, I guess. But we really don't want to do that. So I am running over right now. Let's get back into here. So I think that gives you the idea of how some of these feathers were made. We got some music playing, all right. Is that my cue?
No, that's not your cue. You're doing great.
Damn. So those are those feathers. The next thing that we got into actually took more time than I expected to describe making feathers. Were the coverts. These are the ones that cover our main feathers. So again, I got lazy and I just duplicated the same shape. I would actually like to go in and tweak these up a little bit, make a couple different shapes. But if I don't, I made these things pretty clean. Oops, I thought I made these clean. Yeah, there we go. That have low res and high res. So what that means is that these are very low res. I can go in here and quickly manipulate each one of them individually on the lowest res, step it back up, and I'm going to have all that detail that was in the highest res, and suddenly they start to look a little bit different. They don't look like I just repeated one shape a million times, which is exactly what I did. The alulas, which are going to be little covering feathers. Now, the other interesting thing about feathers that I learned was that the front and back are very different. And I started to go in and actually try to define that a little bit. So if you look at the top of the wing, the secondary coverts are actually exposed, but really most of the interior lining of these wings, it's more just the more downy kind of feathers. But the top ones have a lot more of this layering effect happening. Now, different birds have different effects, so I don't want to say that's a universal thing, but we're making up our creature, and I don't want to spend a million years, so that's what we decided to go with. Okay, so we've got our main feathers in. So these are the big beats, right? We got our anatomy, we got our big feathers in, but what I don't have to do on this creature is focus too much on the good anatomy, because he's going to have feathers going all over his body, or her, And what that means is that we're going to start sculpting in the mass forms. So generally at this point, I would duplicate my character and let go of my anatomy and start worrying more about form. And this gets tricky. Now, I want it to be pretty contoured to his body, but at the same time, I need to make sure that it reads as feathers. So I'm going to use the clay brush to just kind of fill in areas. And what I know is that it's going to fill in on his arms. And this is going to be sculpted. This isn't going to be fiber mesh or something like that, which we could do some interesting things with, or nano mesh. But I just want this to be sculpted onto him. It's going to be a lot easier. Let me find my marginal. There we go. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a separate object that should be a little bit easier to deal with than just sculpting on top of that. And I'm going to tuck him in. So I figured it'd be interesting to see something in progress as opposed to just more finished work in a walkthrough, which we already had done earlier. Hopefully I was right. You guys are learning something here. If not, never tell me. I can't handle criticism. So while we're making our next shape, now that big blocked-in shape is actually going to become a sculpting object. Now, it might be worth doing these guys as separate pieces, but I kind of don't think it would be. I think I would probably go in and try to sculpt these as one shape. The main reason is when I start to pose this guy, it is going to be so difficult to deal with these thousands of feathers already that anything I can do to kind of blend these shapes together is going to be very nice. So we make our little sculpting object here. And I actually tuck him into this because I'm going to do a layered effect using alphas to achieve this look. And I still have my low res, so it's going to be very easy for me to go in and make these a little thinner because they were just getting a little bit thick, and start to shape all of this down. So coming at all of this from the design point, just kind of making sure that it's going to read the way we want it to read. Okay. So the next thing I want to do is start looking at some reference at this point and seeing if there's any cool feathers I can look at. I hope I saved something good with an outspread wing, but I probably didn't. So we're going to look at this. So for these guys, I'm going to go in and just start sculpting in some shapes. Should be relatively simple. First thing we got to do is think about the big block-ins. Always thinking about these big block-ins. I think I'm running a little bit late. Is that okay?
Yeah, about what time we got on yours?
Okay, cool.
About 15 minutes, is that okay? 10, 15 minutes?
Cool. So we'll see how far we can take this, and I'll do some Q&A maybe in the next couple minutes. I don't want to, this point is where we call it getting a little tedious. It's just sculpting it, and it'll look fine though. But I just want to show one last thing really for how we can handle feathers. We've shown extracts, we've shown making individual feathers, and we've shown how to duplicate these things. All of this is great information, but there's one last thing. For the big shapes, for the big forms, we need to still cover this guy in feathers. I've got a plucked chicken right now, and although that's a cool look, it's not going to be very majestic. And I'd like, when I finish this guy, for it to feel like, all right, we got something cool going on here. So I've got some downy feathers, and I've got some little fun feathers here too. Okay, we got this one. So now I can start dividing this guy up, and I'm going to turn my intensity up a little bit. See which direction this is going. Okay. This can be divided quite a lot. There we go. And I am going to flip this upside down because I don't like the way it's going right now. That should be better. Yeah, there we go. And I can start placing some feathers this way. Do I care about it being super precise? Not really. think it's going to all layer together, and then once we get color on this thing, it's going to look pretty feathery. We will have to go in and break the silhouette a little bit. Keep drawing it too low. But I'm still thinking, even though I'm doing it this way, of how they're coming off of the arm from my earlier research. And if I don't like one, I can always smooth it out and start working on it again. These should be a little bit bigger, I think. Then they'll start getting smaller again. So I'm going to work from the bottom up so I can layer them nicely. And then we'll mask some things off, and we'll do a couple extracts based on what we're doing right now. And that will give us a nice, a slightly more organic feel than what I'm doing right now. This might look a little bit rough to you, and I understand. So now I'm going to smooth off the tops a little bit. And we're going to start layering these in. And I can mask off areas if I want to make sure I'm being more precise. And sometimes you might want to add a little bit of the main form before you actually do what we're about to do. Now I borrowed these images from various sites online, so I did not scan in any feathers for this project. If you're working on stuff that's going to be for paid work, you should always make your own alphas and all that stuff, or else you could get in trouble. Or at least augment whatever you find to the point that it's completely unrecognizable. Now, handling feathers, if you're going to do like visual effects, is going to be very different. You're going to actually sculpt these things out and really have to think about how they're going to animate and rig. This level actually is, from what I've done, is usually done either with fur or with alphas and stuff. But we're talking about design sculpting here, and if I had to come up with a character like this, I'm not going to have the time to go in there and make a rig and model a million feathers. I'm going to have time to do exactly what I'm doing right now, hopefully. Honestly, I probably wouldn't go this far. I'd probably just do it big block shapes like this, and then I'd do the rest in Photoshop. I'd paint them. Just these days, I don't do a lot of these final models too much, but they might come back and say, you know, we like this. It needs to be finished now, though. So, okay, I guess I got to go in and sculpt this. So it's good to know how to do these things. It's also good to know just how much you have to do to sell the idea. For me, it would be something more along like, does that look okay? All right, that's starting to look good. Because once I get color on this thing, a lot of what you're seeing here is just going to fade into nothing. Now the next thing is some of these alphas on the edges are looking a little funny. So we're going to actually make an extract off of this. So I'm going to just make one extract to start with. Just like we did before. Doesn't even matter where I do it. I'm going to repeat that stroke. And invert this. I just want to get a little bit of texturing happening on it. It'll be a little easier to deal with. When I said a little bit, I didn't mean a little bit. Okay, here we go. Okay, so we'll invert that. Sharpen that mask up a little. Oops, I blurred it. Sharpen that mask up and extract that piece off. Way too thick. Let's turn that down. Okay. Accept it. Go in here and take a look at what we got. So I'm going to smooth out these edges a little bit. Totally fine. And then I can start layering these guys on. Oops, I got double-sided on that. Don't need that. Let's kill this guy. I'm a Mac user, and the Windows button is the devil. If people are wondering, it's the devil.
While Ian's working on the last parts of the swing, does anybody have any questions in here? Looks like we got a few up front.
Ask away. I'll
I have a feeling these two guys are going to be pretty good. They've asked quite a few questions. I'm proud of
like
both of
that.
these.
Yeah, really, guys, ask
They also
questions.
happen to be like my first term students. Way to go. Let me shake your hand. Good job.
Actually, no, I'm going to ask a really petty question now because you just mentioned Macs, and I'm wondering, is there a reason for that?
Nope.
Is it,
There's really not.
because you look around this school, everything is a PC.
Everything most places is PC. So don't get me wrong. It's nothing wrong with PC. I used PC at Legacy for the longest time. What happened for me was I got an iPhone, and I really liked it. Then I got a MacBook Pro, and it was the greatest laptop I ever had, and I would run Windows on it. And my wife would go, "You're running a really crappy operating system on that thing for something that's built for this other operating system." I was like, "Yeah, OS X sucks." Then I started playing with it, and now I'm addicted. And I'm really sad because all the new professional grade stuff looks terrible. Like the Mac Pros just look ridiculous. I have a supercharged 2013 Mac Pro with the old silver towers that I got. It's stupidly expensive because all the parts, all the video cards and everything on it are like double the cost of what a PC is. So do I have a reason for liking Mac? No, and by saying it out loud, it sounds like I don't. But I really do like OS X. I have a lot less crashes than I used to have. I have just a lot more luck with it. I don't know. I like the fact that virus-wise, it's not nearly as awful as my Windows machines used to be. And so I never really had a problem with it, but I'd always get the warnings and all that stuff, and the Macs have been better. I don't know. Just overall, I just really like the experience.
Do you do a lot of this work on there, or
Do a lot of what now?
do you do a lot of ZBrush work on there?
Oh yeah. ZBrush, Keyshot, Photoshop is my bread and butter all day long. And ZBrush, actually, it's weird. They go like in every other version is good kind of a thing for Mac. Like the last version was really buggy. This version started buggy, and then all of a sudden is really solid on there. Except for I have a dual processor quad core. And for whatever reason, the 64-bit version of ZBrush does not like that. And I have to set my decimation master and other things down to using one core because it will take 7 hours to do something that should take 20 minutes. So that's been really annoying, and they've been trying to figure that out. But it's such a weird configuration that I can't even really get mad at them because no one else really has that. It's, the new ones don't do it. I think Ofair is the only one who has a system like that, and he never even tested it for that. So hopefully on one of the next versions that we're going to see this. Okay, so what you can kind of see I'm doing here is just adding a secondary layer of these covert feathers to go over this, and then I'll start sculpting in as well. So all of these things kind of combine to make a final effect. And though we didn't get to quite finish it, I'm hoping you guys are kind of seeing where this would go in terms of feathering. I think we have a question over here, or over here.
Yeah, we'll go here, and then we'll come over to you then.
Do you currently, or did you ever have a special practice for just further progressing your understanding of form or building more interesting form?
Yeah. One thing I like to do when I'm drawing is, because I don't draw as much as I sculpt, I end up falling into these shape designs all the time that I do. So what I'll do when I'm drawing is if I see someone I like their work, I'll do a very quick sketch of it, just the form of it. And I haven't done it, but I think it would be a really cool experiment, I bet it would work just fine, is to do the same thing with sculpture. Is if you took a designer that you like, or a form you like, or a creature you like, and don't worry about all the detail, but go in there and just really figure out its silhouette in a sculptural form to start getting new things into your mind. I think you asked the question. I'm so blinded here. Hopefully I'm looking at the right person. But yeah, that's one exercise I would say, is doing drawings and stuff like that of shapes you find interesting. It could be as simple as this awesome pen holder I just got. Look at that. Or it could be, a mouse or something like that. One thing that's always useful too is to take everyday objects and try to turn them into creatures. Either anthropomorphizing them or literally looking at this thing and saying like, okay, if this was the head shape and it's got like a long, weird little tongue, you can start doing weird form studies that way. Now, the number one thing that I think everybody should do, myself included, I've been really neglecting this, is full-on anatomy studies like what Steve was showing before. If you start doing écorchés of real animals from the skeleton up, from human beings from the skeleton up, and then figuring out, like on this thing, the changes that happen when you start putting on fat, when you start putting on feathers, those kind of things, you're going to learn so much about form language. You'll see a lot of times in design that cool creatures are done by taking like a hip bone and turning it into a head, or taking a vertebrae column and making that into some sort of exposed bit on the back of a creature. And that's because these people start studying these shapes and going, God, that's cool, I want to see more of that, and then bringing that into their designs. So I guess that would be my answer for that question.
Quick question. Since 3D printing is essentially starting to come in large numbers, do you have a certain way where you have to model it to have special supports for the 3D printing to render in order for it to not crash and melt on you?
Every 3D printer is going to be different. So no, there's not a select way of doing it. I've been very lucky in that everything I've done from before was all done through Legacy, so I actually had access to some of the most expensive, high-precision printers you can imagine. It also meant we also used MakerBots, and I just want to show something really quick. I did a lot of show and tell on this one. I apologize if that was boring, but hopefully it was entertaining. Where is it? So this was done on a machine that is very expensive. This was multi-$1,000 worth of material. It was about this tall. This was done on a MakerBot, and those lines you see are not grow lines. That's actually a material defect. So the detail on this thing is astounding. Like, you get full pore detail. We had to crank it up into a way to make it work. The teeth look a little bit jagged because they were so thin, and MakerBots just aren't really built for that. But all the form and all the secondary stuff read beautifully. So you can take this and do a clay press on it, no problem. This guy right here, I already have him molded up. I'm trying to make a really limited run of prints for him. I got to call the guy actually about that. But every detail you can imagine showed up on that one. So they're very different approaches. Like for this guy, I had to make a certain settings on him to make him really read correctly. For the big lizard, I had to take that same file, if it was this big or this big, and do a lot of different tweaks to it to make it work. In terms of support, I don't do a lot of internal supports, but what I do a lot of is, first off, you have to core things. Like this is my wedding cake topper. Yeah, I know. So that was on our wedding cake. So what was interesting about this is that it was a big chunk of resin, and it was so heavy it would have crushed the thing. So what I had to do is actually make a very thin spot on the bottom and core it so the inside was hollow, and then it filled with support material. But I had to make sure it was thick enough that if it got heated or anything else happened, it would still support itself. Some of the other creatures you saw, like the Neighborhood Watch one, they left it out in the car. Actually, the Cowboys and Aliens one, they left it in the back of a car in the sun, and it just went, brrr. And then we had to heat it up and straighten it back out. Yeah, so you got to be careful with those kind of things on these materials, and that's why molding them is always a good idea afterward. Pardon me.
Hi, so I just had a question about your process specifically. Like in the beginning of your presentation, you kind of showed how you created like a basic form in ZBrush, and then you photoshopped over it. Is that like literally your starting point, or do you do like really quick sketches first and then kind of go into that?
So for those guys I showed you from the class, like, yeah, that was very much, I show that a lot when I'm early discovering. I'm so comfortable in ZBrush now that I do most of it all in ZBrush. Like this bird guy, I didn't do anything on him in Photoshop. It was just like, I literally started this off as a Microraptor, and then I kept developing him, and if I went through all my versions, actually I'll show you one, it's kind of funny. I was doing him as like a little owl character, an owl monkey. Woohoo! Ha-cha! But then he just got a little too funny, so I wanted to do something like a little bit meaner looking. But there's still something there I think would have been kind of fun to keep developing. But that was the same sculpt. It just kept evolving as I went. And I went, you know what? I really want to get this out. So it's like I say this is 3D sketching. I really mean it. When I'm really stuck and I need to figure out a new form language, or if like one of my worst things is eyes. I always have my little default stamp eye. And I don't mean like I have a stamp. I mean in my brain. I go, that's the shape of an eye. No, it's not. It's a fake little icon. So I always have to go back and really look at eyes again whenever I'm sculpting eyes, because I can do something that looks good enough that most people are like, oh, that's cool. But in my head, I look at it, I hate that. So, so sometimes I'll go into Photoshop and just paint over things or even do red lines over things to go, to myself, fix this. This looks like crap. Like fix these things. But less and less now. The more I do it, I do it more discovery in ZBrush. Now, where I really do a lot more of the paint over stuff was in the neighborhood watch thing, which I guess I have to open up in this guy, so here, bear with me. But this is what I do a lot of now, where I'll do a very rough sculpture, and I will take it into Photoshop and do full color paint job on top of it. So some of these were like literally just like that bird thing you saw where there's just a form. I hit some shadow on it, and I took it into Photoshop and went to town on it. This is my more of my process now. I don't show black and white models almost ever until I'm further along. It's always going to be something a little bit nicer looking, unless I mostly don't do modeling jobs these days, but occasionally I do. Then, of course, I'm going to show the model. But I don't mean like modeling, like, I don't do that either. But this is more the process that I go through on these. Or like, where are these guys? Cool.
My interests are more along the lines of 3D modeling and stuff. And I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, but do you think more towards into the future and your experience in the field, do you think if a person is more specialized in something, say like a 2D concept artist, or if you're specifically a 3D modeler, do you think that's going to go extinct?
Yeah, I think you're always going to have your specialists. It's almost impossible to be, I am great at everything. You're going to be better at one thing or the other. There's guys who are such brilliant painters that maybe they'll just use 3D to just get them ahead a little bit quicker and jump forward. There's guys who are such great 3D artists who they might use painting just to fudge the details where they didn't have time to finish them off in terms of concept art. As a 3D modeler, though, stick with it. When it comes to the digital, when it comes to design of like robots and vehicles, so much of that now is done just as beautiful 3D models. I almost don't even see, SketchUp models sometimes, but a lot of times it's like SketchUp model and then an awesome paint job on top of it so it looks like a 3D model, or a SketchUp model brought into a really finished state so it is a 3D model. So if you're a 3D modeler, like there's no problem with that. When it comes to creature design, I think the problem is 3D models tend to look like 3D models, and without a lot of rendering and a lot of material setup or a lot of painting, they're going to look static and boring and kind of dead. So knowing how to paint and understanding lighting and all of that comes into play for doing creature design, as well as all the sculpting and anatomy and everything else. The other thing is doing feathers, doing fur, way faster to do that in Photoshop on top of your nice sculpture rather than doing what I did today, because if I had to like give these ideas, I wouldn't want to give this one idea after, I'm still working on it and I worked yesterday on it. So I'd probably have this thing ready to be into a comp by, like if I spent a day and a half on it, by doing all the feathering like I'm doing right now. That's a lot of time to do something the director might go, no, thank you. So it'd be much better to just get this sculpture done very quickly and the big block in shapes, and then take that into Photoshop, overlay some photos, paint on it, and show them a bunch of different ideas, and then once they like it, come back in for a secondary pass like this. To me, this would be a secondary pass where you have a little bit more time and you know your direction. Yeah, you're going to pick your battle. You're going to pick the one that you love the most, and you're going to stick with it. And if you're interested in concept, that's what I'm talking about. If you're talking about production, you can be a 3D person, you can be a 2D person. It's very different. But concept is definitely becoming a hybrid, in my opinion.
So, let's everybody give Ian a huge round of applause for actually.
Thanks for having me.
Again, we're at Gnomon. You can always check in online, hashtag at Gnomon, every time that we do our events. This is an anatomy lab. We're going to be doing quite a few other lab-type events that are kind of specialized on specific areas of the skill set, FX lab, animation lab, so on and so forth. So stay tuned to our site and our newsletter. We'll let you know who we're bringing in, what we're doing. It's always going to be somebody amazing, such as Steve and Ian. I really want to thank both those guys for their time. They've done an amazing job. Jumping off and being able to do something like this on the fly and then doing it in front of everyone in under a week, that's pretty amazing. So one more big round of applause for Ian.
Thanks, guys.
And, stay tuned, check in. We look forward to seeing you guys again soon. And that's it for today. Thanks, everyone.